Hey, everybody. Can you believe it? We're here in front of you. Um, so, what are we talking about, Victor?
Well, suspension of disbelief. That is a concept that essentially is what almost all of fantasy and most of sci-fi is based around. What is it that happens when the Star Trek crew starts jammering on about main deflector dishes and particle beams, and none of the and most, if not all of these terms don't mean jack to us?
Or
But
the biggest suspension of disbelief is that the entire officer corps and bridge crew are the ones that are the away team. Like
that too.
your most important people on the ship. That if any of them died, would be critical manning loss.
But it's all right. We have a red shirt. He'll take the blame. He's basically the substitute from Pokemon.
Yeah, got a bunch of people who are super important to it, and if killed or caught, could be detrimental to the entire Union issue. Let's put them on a planet with a bunch of natives that are trying to kill them. Um,
Yeah.
so
And
it's one of those things that, like, I think we always, when we talk about suspension of disbelief, there is a level of I think the Covillians, and probably obviously he got it from others, but the verisimilitude that it needs to feel right in the situation. When you're watching Star Trek, that feels right that they go out and do it, even though it makes no sense in a military capacity. But not only does it make sense, but it is enjoyable. So that's also another aspect. Is like, is it satisfying to break that suspension of disbelief for those reasons?
yeah.
And I think that's what we're here to discuss. And we're going to probably use examples outside of D&D, but we're going to always bring it back to D&D. And, like, what do you have to explain away? And what should you just be okay with maybe not? Where we're at. I think this is going to be one of those ones where we don't really have any good answers to you. And actually might accidentally make your gaming a little worse as you're thinking about it too much. But I think it's going to be a fun discussion. I think this is going to be one of our more jokey ones. So hopefully everybody has a good
Yeah.
time with this one.
Yeah. Now I can tell you right now that if I'm not actively restraining myself and I'm watching movies, I can be an absolute pain because I am one of those people who overthink and question, why didn't they just do that? You could that, and so on and so forth. I remember one movie I said where some witch character or whatever had a bunch of shards of metals conjured into like a warrior.
Hmm.
And my immediate question is, why didn't they just use the shards that are clearly sharp and just swarm the enemy with
Yeah.
them, rather than making them into a character that can then be broken apart? And my father immediately told me to shut the hell up.
Which is probably a good response often enough. Because, yeah, ultimately, I think just about any movie can be, or any media, whatever, anything that we're trying to ingest and be entertained by can be picked apart in this regard, and it's almost impossible, especially if you're dealing with sci-fi or fantasy concepts, because these have a lot of moving parts. Whereas in a movie that is like super based on realism, where it's just like two people hanging out and talking, really hard to break down in this kind of way, because there's not all these moving parts that can be, one grain of sand ruins the whole thing, right?
Unless they talk about things that don't make sense in the context. Glorious.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I think especially with the Star Wars examples given there, is that sometimes a very brief explanation. I think Obi-Wan's in A New Hope. Obi-Wan's explanation of the Force, that was kind of like a one sentence explanation, and moves through us, it binds us. I think that was good for everybody. I think at the time and since, everybody's been kind of like, I accept the Force. I have no questions about the Force, right? Maybe there was
This
some.
is a soft concept that we cannot nail down and define
Exactly.
completely.
It kind of falls into the magic, big M magic, where it's just like it happens, and the further you go down the rabbit hole, it does not make it better; it makes it worse.
Yeah.
So, but that's how you should treat your D&D for the most part. Is that sometimes concepts need to be mentioned, but maybe not fully divulged, and it makes it better.
Indeed, indeed. And I mean, for the example I mentioned with the metal shards and the witch turning them into a creature, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense if the spell she is using is specifically to do that and nothing else. And in that context, might make more sense, at least from a player's perspective, when you're dealing with spells, because you have an exact description of what they actually do and what they can and cannot do.
I'm gonna take this again back to
relatively
movies.
Exact, of course.
Yeah,
there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, I'm gonna take it back to movies just for a second, because I think a really good test that you can put that's a lot of fun is Hitchcock's refrigerator test. Hitchcock was a director of many powerful films, and he would pose. It said if he can get you to believe in what's happening on the screen all the way until that night when you wake up in the middle of the night to go to your refrigerator to have a midnight snack, and while you're looking at the refrigerator you go, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. He beat you because you left the theater and you were totally okay with it. While you were in the moment, everything was fine. But then it later is when it dawned on you that it didn't make sense. But in the moment, he got you. I think that's a pretty fair test to make it not so overwhelmingly difficult for artists, but making it to where viewers can still ingest the property without feeling like they've been cheated. Or whatever you feel like when you feel like something doesn't make any sense. The Hitchcock's refrigerator test is a pretty strong one.
Yeah, and I personally really like. I'm a big fan of, in D&D and such, of dreams and visions and spirit journeys or drug trips, scenarios where essentially all the parameters of reality is broken down, because we have a framing that says this is okay, nothing has to make sense, nothing should make sense. At most, things might symbolize something, but you're gonna have to think about it before you before it makes any sense, and that's the point.
Yeah. I often use those as a way, so I like to plant a lot of seeds for the narrative that's coming and a lot of the points that are coming. So I will throw out stuff that I have no context for and I have nothing written for, as like visions or kind of like what you were talking about, and give them to players, and then players ruminate on that and maybe even have a discussion with me or other players for weeks on end about that. And in a combination of me having the kind of above the top down view of everything that's going on, combined with them kind of almost spitballing ideas to the whiteboard of what would be cool, of like what they think is happening, I combine all these into a big frothy broth, and then that's how I generally create my narratives. Is like, that's a really good idea, I'm gonna pick that a little bit. I know this is going on over here, so I'm gonna pick that a little bit, and then boom, that thing that I threw out there, a one sentence thing that had nothing to do with anything at first, is actually huge in the entire narrative.
I love building off of small things and being able to integrate them into a massive weave that is an magnum opus of a web of a story.
Yeah, I think it's super important for narratives. It's very important for narratives.
Yeah. What I also like to do, though, is, because, and some might frown on this, but I from time to time I will use songs and as inspiration for scenarios and specific events, and maybe and specific enemy or something. And what I'll do is I'll not so subtly drop one of these into the chat room where I have where the party is, and I might not add anything to it. And sometimes it might not actually be something that's informed me. But once they've had something happen in room 24 of a hotel, and I've dropped a song that's literally named Room 24, they start looking for patterns.
Yeah. No, I think
they start analyzing lyrics, and they start going, okay, what is this about?
Yeah, especially based on what system you're using. If you're using more of a modern system, maybe like a Trail. Well, I guess Trail of Cthulhu is not a really good example, but like modern, where music is a part of kind of the zeitgeist of whatever system you're using. I think that's a really clever way of making it more engaging and interesting. So I like that. So the suspension of disbelief, I think one of the important factors in it is it something that if you're having a problem with suspension of disbelief, is it something that you are nitpicking and making worse, or is it something that actually like is detrimental to the game?
And
Yeah.
we also have to define if when something actually is detrimental. If you're in a scenario and a character says, let's say the GM, let's say, uses an ability or a spell on a character, and let's say a wizard or a arcane trickster rogue identifies the spell, and they say, wait, this spell has these parameters, it doesn't work in this context.
Yep. So context matters in this regard. Your suspension of disbelief on like whether a villain can do something or not. Often you as a player do not have all of the context for what's going on. So you two immediately throw out, well, that's not how that spell works. And it's like, they're not the DM.
Not this one.
Yeah, the DM, their trolls, their magic spells, all these things are not bound by the restrictions within the player's handbook.
Yeah, which is why I always, when I do use something that doesn't strictly adhere to its rules, say that it's like this, but it's not quite the same. Something's off.
The old DM just. I don't like describing things as they are. I like describing things how they may be.
Yeah, you give a general like starting point, but then say that it's not quite there. You say in this ballpark.
Yeah.
Now you can try and figure it out if you need to.
Yeah, often in the context of D&D, you will have a much better time if you assume at all times that the villains are working off of a skewed and different capability of you. They have something that, for whatever reason, whatever dark powers or whatever they're into, is giving them the ability to expand their knowledge and capabilities beyond the parameters of normality.
Yeah, as I believe Dawnforge once said that NPCs do not follow the same class restrictions, and they have access to innumerable other lists of spells.
Yep. You will drive yourself crazy if you try to pigeonhole everything you come across, even monsters. Like don't think you know the stat blocks, because the DM has no requirements to adhere to those. So instead of focusing on the mechanics, we focus on the narrative and go, ooh, that's interesting. Why is it like that? And we focus on that instead of going, but it should have 14 AC.
Yeah, that is the nitpicky kind of breaking of suspension of disbelief.
Mm-hmm.
There's also other factors, like a scenario I've told you about. Well, not scenario, but a premise. And there's currently the third trailer, I believe, for Shazam, the movie. There's a part in it where a bus is crashing down from a bridge or something. I can't remember the exact details, but basically he stops it just before it lands. But in a comment or something that I saw, someone pointed out that if you stop it that quickly, everyone in it is probably dead or paralyzed anyway. But at the same time, this is a movie with a lot of comedic themes when it comes to the mood and such. So they don't, as far as I can tell, have anyone in the bus actually get injured, but the realization that logically within the physics of reality they should have been. There's the idea of what the setting is and how real that is. There's the mood and tone and what that means, and there's the elements that do not adhere to normal reality and how their rules work.
Yeah. It's a question on, it is kind of the Hitchcock's refrigerator rule. Is it satisfactory in the moment? I think watching a trailer outside of I don't watch trailers ever. For any movies.
I normally don't either. I think this one was I scrolled by it on social media or something.
Yeah. For that exact reason too, I don't want scenes, because often they use the best scenes in the trailers, so I don't want those scenes ruined for me as the joke I've already seen. And then two, I don't have the context for the scene. So sometimes, like if I go and watch Shazam, which I'm going to, I'm hoping to have a great time. I'm hoping that scene, obviously it's mentioned to me, so it'll probably kind of ruin a little bit for me, but I'll be all right, I promise. That in context in that scene, probably would have never thought about it. Would have passed the refrigerator test. I would have had a great time. I'd have been like, ha ha ha, you know. So I think it goes down to, is it worth? I think always we should strive as creators, artists. You know, DMing is an art to it as well. I think we should always strive to make these feel more real, and at least within context feel real. When I say real, in context with all the logic that's going on, make it feel logical. I think we should strive for that. But I don't like to have perfection be the enemy of great. So sometimes at the end of the day, you have to cut it and you have to say, release it to the wild. We finished the art. It's as good as we're going to make it with what we have available to us. So sometimes things are going to get through. But at the end of the day, if you made something that was interesting and engaging enough, a lot of those little flaws will be waived by people because they had such a good time. Whereas if you didn't make something that was really engaging, those little portions are probably going to be torn apart.
Yeah. Here's another counterpoint to the example from Shazam, though. Because that is set in reality, besides the fact that superheroes exist, it gets that context when it comes to the physics of reality and such. But then we have 1960s Batman, where he has a relatively an apparently infinite number of slots on his belt, where he even has space for something as ludicrously contextually useful as bat shark repellent. But we don't question it as surreal because the entire framing is so camp and ridiculous and silly, especially to our modern eyes, that we don't question it in that way.
No.
It doesn't take us out of it because that is part of it.
Yeah, it's not a joke because it doesn't make sense. It's a joke because it's so ridiculous and it's so big and it still fits in context. That's the part that's weird about it. And that's what makes it so funny and makes it work. But yeah, it's totally ridiculous. Because
as ridiculous as that the 1960s Batman is, it's completely consistent with itself.
Yep.
And that is what makes it so great in that way. Whilst the fact that the world in the Shazam example we brought up is essentially reality, that brings on a whole set of questions that can be added. Whether they should and when they should is a completely different parameter. But
it's those moving gears problems again, right? Because you're talking about physics and all this stuff. And
at the same time, you have to establish one mood and setting, and you can't just jump into a different one unless you have, I don't know, a dream scenario or something to explain or excuse it, to give that framework of this is why this is happening that doesn't fit the normal thing.
I know you didn't see it, but Into the Spider-Verse has that, where they have basically Spider-Men from different dimensions. And one of them is literally like a cartoon pig, Spider Pig.
Yeah, I've seen enough trailers and heard enough people rave on about how it's the greatest animation since animation, basically.
I don't know if I'd go that far, but I will say I had a great time watching
I'm
the
not
film.
Speaking literally,
of course. But
in terms of the zeitgeist.
But bringing it back to D&D in particular, I think one of the important aspects, and I think a tool, is if we're gonna, instead of just kind of recounting and having a good time with this video, which we are, we give a little bit of tool to some of the newer DMs, because we don't do a lot of that. Sometimes when you are creating your NPCs with their motivation to include villains and things like that, you'll have it all outlined and maybe even really well thought out of like why they're doing this. And then inevitably, either like in character or out of character, or not even in session maybe, a player will say something and be like, why wouldn't they just do this? And you stop for a moment and you're like, oh my God, why wouldn't my NPC just do that? And your best response to that is, weird, huh? And then when nobody's around, you write a reason why that's not happening. That way,
or if it makes sense in context, you just say, or you can also just say, would be nice if he knew that, wouldn't it?
Yeah. The weird gives it to where you're not giving any out of no metagame knowledge. that the player wouldn't have of like why they're doing it. It also allows you an out if you do want to change something around.
If it is something very small, but something that interests the party because it doesn't make sense, you can just say, yeah, too bad he doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And then you can just leave it behind and move on. But if it's something important, your approach is has much more potential.
Yeah, it could potentially even be an entire plot hook that makes your story better. Don't get defensive and start combating that point. If anything, they're accidentally helping you make your stuff better.
In relation to the Shazam scenario and the Batman from the 1960s scenario, as in terms of advice, if you set up the world and how you play in it with certain parameters, people are going to expect those parameters in other areas. I've never met someone who does this, but if you're literally the kind of person who counts every copper and tells them how much each individual drink at the pub costs, and has them count how much they can carry and so on and so forth, they are going to expect that, and that is going to be part of the verisimilitude. And if they are attached to this, you are going to have a hard time breaking these parameters of realism, or whatever you want to call them, without the party questioning or feeling like they're losing touch with what the story on the game actually is.
Yep.
On the other hand, if you are having going very loose and easy with it, and then you start asking for details, people are going to be like, wait, why is this important?
Yep.
And they're either going to start looking for deeper meaning or wonder what the heck you're doing.
Yeah. I actually had a session yesterday where I had this kind of problem. That the holy symbol of a cleric is important to the plot. And I did not have a good way without tipping my hand to be like, is your holy symbol visible right now? To that kind of jars and makes everybody out, pull themselves out. Now they're thinking as players instead of in character, right? If I say, is your holy symbol visible right now? They're like, oh, why would he say that? Is this going to be important? All these questions are running through their head, and we're not playing anymore. And that's kind of that ruining of suspension of disbelief. But I didn't really have a good way of doing it. You know what I mean? Like, had I been a better DM, I probably would have asked 2 or 3 sessions earlier before it was a thing, probably even out of session, where does it show? Does it on, had these questions, and then by the time they forget about it, it would come into play. But I'm not a good DM all the time, so I make mistakes. So,
no one is.
Yeah, I make mistakes, and so I ruined a little bit of that suspension of disbelief, got them out of character for a little bit, but luckily my players are good. They roll with the punches, and they moved on with it. So that, in context, that's an example of messing that up.
There's also, if I may make a callback to our video on theory of the mind versus grid for a quick moment. This also ties back to that, because you might have a different set of parameters for what the world and the reality and such are, what the rules are when you go from one to the other. Mm-hmm. So you get a different sense of what will break or not break your suspension of disbelief in one or the other.
Yeah.
If you go from role play to the table to the grid, you are stepping into a different mindset.
Yep. And I think the through line, because we're not really helping, this is a very nebulous idea to grapple with. Yeah. I think the best use that we could have to give to you so that you take something away from here is that consistency is the key. That will help. It's not gonna be bulletproof, but the consistency will help it to where 9 times out of 10, people are not going to question their suspension of disbelief. They're going to continue, and they're going to have a good time. Losing that consistency is where you start getting into these issues.
Yeah, you need to establish what the consistency is, what the world and the rules and such and the mood generally are. You need to maintain them so long that they become natural, and then once these parameters break, they have that much more impact if you do it carefully. Because once the setting is in there and they know it, and then let's say you've put in let's say you're playing in a low magic setting or something, and there's not much magic going on at all besides the players, and you've had that going for like 15 episodes, and then suddenly something massively magical happens. That doesn't necessarily break it, because you've had the prior training ground to establish what is normal, and now you have this point to show, okay, something very far from normal just happened and we need to investigate.
Yeah, it can be a really useful tool on making interesting hooks, is maintaining that consistency, and then having that almost having that cake and eating it too, is when you're able to break it for really big sell.
And establish the rules before they can safely be broken.
Yep, definitely like that. Do you have any further points in regard to suspension of disbelief, Victor?
I don't think so. We're probably going to think of other details, but this is one of those topics that we could, given enough time and research, we could go forever.
Yep. I think just it should be something that, as a DM, a younger DM, probably not a skill that you need to work on early on. I think once you have a lot of your
and by younger we mean less experienced.
Yeah, sorry. I really think it should definitely be something that you work on in your kind of, once you get into you are a experienced DM and you're trying to get to that veteran DM level. That's something that you need to work on. But initially, just have fun, roll some dice, work on your narratives, and it will gradually grow. It's not something that needs to be focused on entirely.
Yeah. Train those GM muscles up, then, so you have some proper ones, and then later, when you've built them, you can use them further.
Yeah, it's one of those last skills and values that really takes from a lot of other ones, so you can't just build it by itself. All right.
Yeah.
That's all I got. See you later, guys.